Mara Voss had learned early in life that the best way to survive in a palace was to be invisible. She moved between tables with her silver tray balanced perfectly on one hand, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, her eyes fixed just below the eyeline of every important person in the room. She was 24 years old, hired 3 weeks ago through the city's staffing agency to serve at the Royal Palace of Valdemar for the season. She wore the standard uniform, a dark dress, white apron, hair pulled back tight, and she did her job well, precisely because nobody noticed her doing it. That was the point. That was the skill. The Covenant Banquet happened every year on the last Thursday of autumn. It was the night when every noble house in the kingdom sent its head to the palace to sit at the long oak table and renew their loyalty oath to the Alpha King. There was music, there were speeches, there was an enormous amount of food, and beneath all of it, like a river running under ice, there was politics. Mara could feel it in the air, the way you feel a storm coming, not quite visible yet, but definitely on its way. She didn't care about politics. She cared about doing her job, collecting her payment, and getting back to her grandmother's small apartment in the lower quarter of the city before the cold night set in. That was what she told herself anyway. King Aldrich Drave sat at the head of the table like he had been carved there. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had seen too much to give anything away easily. He had ruled for 12 years after inheriting a kingdom that was barely holding itself together, and in that time, he had turned it into something that worked. Not perfect, no kingdom ever was, but functional, stable, and feared by the right people. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and remembered everything. Tonight, he was speaking with the Duchess of the Northern Reach about grain supply routes, but his eyes moved around the table at regular intervals, cataloging, assessing, the way a general surveys a battlefield even when there is no battle happening. Yet, Mara had watched him for 3 weeks, not out of fascination, out of professional necessity. Knowing where the king was at any given moment meant knowing where the most important tray needed to be delivered, where the most careful steps had to be taken. She knew he preferred his wine at room temperature. She knew he ate slowly. She knew that he was surrounded at all times by people who wanted something from him, and that he navigated this with the patience of someone who had long since accepted it as a condition of his life. She did not envy him, not even slightly. The evening moved through its courses, the hall filled with conversation and the soft sound of string music from the gallery above. Mara's feet began to ache, as they always did around the second hour, but she kept moving. Collect, deliver, return, repeat. It was during the third course that the head server, a stiff man named Gregor, pulled her aside near the kitchen entrance. "The east corridor tray," he said. "Someone left it by the linen closet. Go fetch it and bring it back before anyone sees it sitting there." She nodded and went. The east corridor was one of the back passages used exclusively by palace staff, a long, narrow hall with low lighting, lined on one side by service doors and on the other by tall velvet curtains that divided the working areas of the palace from the decorative ones. Mara walked quickly, her footsteps muffled by the thin runner of carpet that stretched the length of the hall. She found the tray outside the linen closet, just as Gregor had said. She picked it up, turned to leave, and then stopped. There were voices coming from behind the curtain to her left. She would have kept walking. She genuinely would have. Conversations happened in back corridors at palace events, staff gossip, minor disagreements, the quiet negotiations that never made it to the main table. None of it was her business. But she heard a name. "Aldrich will not see it coming," said a voice she recognized immediately. Low, smooth, careful. It belonged to Lord Casson Vale, the king's oldest advisor and closest ally, a man who had stood at the king's side for the entire 12 years of his reign and several years before that. Mara did not move. "The men are in position," said a second voice, one she did not recognize. "The chamberlain confirmed it an hour ago. 16, in the lower barracks. They've been there since yesterday, arriving in small groups." "And the signal?" Lord Casson asked. "Green lantern in the north tower. The moment it's lit, they move. The king's personal guard will be redirected to the south gate on false intelligence. We've already sent the report. He'll have no one between him and us." A pause. Then Lord Casson spoke again, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made everything feel colder. The decree is ready. Once he signs it, or once it appears he has signed it, regency passes to me. By morning, Valdemar has a new authority. Tell your man in the tower, midnight, not before. Mara stood absolutely still for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 4 seconds. Then she walked away. She walked back to the kitchen, set the tray on the counter, and stood with both hands flat on the wooden surface, looking at nothing. Around her, the kitchen staff moved with the busy energy of people who had 40 more plates to get out, and no time to think about anything else. Steam rose from pots. Someone called for more bread. The string music from the gallery filtered faintly through the walls. Her mind was doing something she could only describe as trying to find a door in a room that had no doors. She could say nothing. That was the easiest thing. She was a waitress from the lower quarter. She had no proof, only words she had overheard in a corridor, words that would mean nothing against the testimony of a lord who had served the crown for 15 years. She could be dismissed, arrested, or worse. She thought about that very clearly and without self-pity, because she had learned a long time ago that thinking clearly in difficult moments was one of the only real advantages a person without power actually had. She could also say something, and everything that happened afterward, good or bad, would be whatever it was. She thought about her parents. They had disappeared when she was 9 years old. No explanation, no investigation, no answers. Just 2 people who had been there one morning and gone by afternoon, swallowed by a silence that the people in charge had never seen fit to break. Her grandmother had told her, gently and firmly, that sometimes the world swallows people, and there is nothing to be done about it. Mara had spent 15 years deciding whether she believed that. She decided, standing in that kitchen with her hands on the counter, that she did not. Getting to the king directly was not simple. The banquet hall had guards at every main entrance, and a junior waitress asking to speak with the king would be turned away before she finished her sentence. She tried the first guard, who looked at her the way people look at things they have already dismissed. She moved to a side entrance and found it attended by 2 guards instead of 1. She stood in the service corridor and thought. Then she went to find Gregor. Elise is sick, she said, keeping her voice flat and practical. She can't do the king's next course. I'll take it. Gregor looked at her with mild suspicion, then at the clock on the kitchen wall, then at the growing chaos of a kitchen managing 38 courses across 12 tables. Fine, he said. Don't spill anything. She carried the silver platter out from the kitchen, through the side door and into the banquet hall. The noise and warmth of the room hit her all at once after the quiet of the corridor. The long table stretched before her, lined with faces she mostly did not recognize, and at the far end, King Aldrich sat with his back straight and his expression attentive, listening to something the Duchess was saying. Mara walked the length of the table. Her hands were steady. She had decided, somewhere between the kitchen and the door, that shaking would not help anything. She reached the king's place setting. She leaned forward to set the plate, the way she had done 100 times in 3 weeks, her movements smooth and practiced. And as she placed the dish in front of him and straightened the edge of it with one finger, she bent just slightly closer and spoke at a volume that existed only between the 2 of them. My lord, the North Tower, Lord Casson, before midnight. I heard it myself. She straightened. She picked up the empty plate that had been there before. She walked back the way she had come, at exactly the same pace, without looking back. Behind her, the king took a sip of wine. He did not look up. He did not change his expression. He said something light and unremarkable to the Duchess, and she laughed softly in response. The conversation continued, as though the world had not shifted. 4 minutes later, he excused himself. What happened next happened quietly, the way the most important things usually do. The king's personal guard, 12 men who answered only to him, and had proven themselves over years, not weeks, moved through the palace in pairs. They were not running. They were not shouting. They moved with the economy of people who understood that noise was a warning, and warnings gave people time to prepare. Lord Casson Vale was intercepted in the West Passage, halfway to a staircase that would have taken him toward the North Tower. He was given no opportunity to signal anyone. The 2 men with him, aides who were not actually aides, were detained separately. The chamberlain, whose voice Mara had not recognized in the corridor, was found in the records room, burning a document over a small candle. The document was not entirely destroyed. Investigators would later spend 2 weeks reconstructing it. The 16 men in the lower barracks waited. Midnight came and went. The Green Lantern never appeared in the North Tower. They waited another hour, then began discussing among themselves what had gone wrong, which was exactly the kind of conversation that made the job of the guards who came through the door much easier. But even precise, well-handled situations have edges that cannot be controlled. When word began to spread through the banquet hall, carried first by whisper, then by the unmistakable sound of raised voices from somewhere else in the palace, the guests reacted with the particular panic of powerful people who are accustomed to being the ones in control of events and suddenly find themselves inside one instead. 2 noble lords attempted to leave and found the palace gates sealed. One demanded an explanation from a guard who had no authority to give him one. Another, convinced he was being accused of something, became loudly and pointlessly defensive. A fire started in the east wing, small, quickly contained, its cause never quite settled, and the combination of the smoke smell and the sealed gates produced a stretch of about 40 minutes that the palace staff would describe for years afterward as the longest 40 minutes of their professional lives. Mara spent those 40 minutes in a small stone room near the kitchen corridor, sitting on a wooden chair, answering questions from a serious young man in the king's uniform who wrote everything down in a small leather book. She told him what she had heard, in order, without adding anything and without leaving anything out. He asked her to repeat it twice. She did. Then he left, and she sat alone with a wool blanket someone had thought to bring her, listening to the muffled sounds of controlled chaos moving through the palace walls. She did not feel like a hero. She felt tired and slightly cold, and very aware that she still had 3 tables of dishes to collect before the night was officially over. The king came to see her just before dawn. He walked into the small room alone, which surprised her, and he sat across from her at the plain table rather than standing, which surprised her more. He was still wearing his formal coat from the banquet, though the ceremonial pin at the collar had been removed and was probably sitting in his pocket. He looked like a man who had been awake all night, which he had. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Why did you come to me?" Mara considered the question. "Because I heard something I was not supposed to hear," she said, and doing nothing felt worse than doing something. "You had no proof," he said, "and no position, and no protection if I had chosen not to believe you." "I know," she said. "That concerns me," he said, "more than the conspiracy itself, that someone in your position would take that risk." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she said nothing. The king was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In 12 years, no one at that table gave me what you gave me tonight. Not one of them. They all have things to lose," Mara said. "I don't have very much." He studied her. "Your name. Voss." "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. "I want to know more about your family," he said simply. "I'll have someone look into it." She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because something about that name is familiar to me," he said, "and familiar things that I cannot place tend to mean I missed something I shouldn't have. I don't like missing things." He stood. He told her that a formal commendation would be issued in her name, that a position at the palace was available to her if she wanted it, and that she would be escorted home safely when she was ready. He said all of this in the plain, direct tone of a man handling things efficiently, which she appreciated far more than ceremony would have been. He left. The room was quiet again. Mara sat for a little while longer. Outside, the city was starting to lighten at the edges, that particular gray that comes just before sunrise, when the sky looks like it hasn't quite decided what it's going to do yet. Inside the palace, the investigation was fully underway. Noble houses were already recalculating their positions. The Covenant banquet would be discussed, analyzed, and argued over for a generation. When she finally walked out through the palace gates and into the cool morning air of Valdermoor, she felt, more than anything else, the simple and honest weight of a long night ending. She had not changed the world. She had heard something and told someone, and that had been enough. She pulled her coat tighter and walked home through streets that were just beginning to wake.